I've had a few people ask me now if I've watched the FriendlyJordies video on the Housing Australia Future Fund and whether or not I was going to do a video on it. Initially, my response was no. I mean, besides the fact that the video goes for 65 minutes, I was kind of just expecting it to be 80% shitty
Crikey dingo
on the Greens, 15% talking about the genius of Labor, and maybe 5% actually looking at the HAFF. Having watched it now, I have to say I'm not sure I was that far off the mark. This video ended up a lot longer than I originally intended it, so I've split it into two parts. Part 1, which is what you're watching right now, looks at the first half of the Jordies video, which generally focused on the HAFF. While Part 2, which covers the second half of his video, looked at a lot of other stuff such as rent control, the research around that, how bad the Greens are, and basically anything else to try and distract you from just how bad the HAFF actually is. I think I can preface this whole video with a little game of hypothetical. Let's imagine a world where the coalition won the last federal election. Let's imagine that it was them that were trying to push through the HAFF bill. I just can't see anyone publishing a 65-minute long video in its defence. Do you? Alright, let's take a look at the main points. This table here. Now both sides of the debate will pull this one out and highlight whichever number best suits their argument. Like I've said many times before, yes, it's true that the Future Fund more often than not makes a positive return. But yes, it's also true that the Future Fund did lose money last year. And that's the thing with investing on the stock market. The returns can go up and down. Over the longer term, you'll more than likely generate a positive return. But if you're looking for a consistent funding source, and a funding source to address a problem we have right now, this isn't it. There's an important fact that neither side will tell you when they point at these figures. And that is that not all funds managed by the Future Fund board are created equal. They all have different investment mandates. Investment mandates set out the government's expectations of the Future Fund Board and how they'll invest the assets of each fund, which usually sets an expected benchmark on the return. This gives the Future Fund Board a rough guideline on how to manage the risk profile to generate that return. It's important to note that the HAFF bill outlines that it's the responsibility of the Minister to outline the fund's investment mandate, and that as of right now the government have not published what that investment mandate will be for the HAFF. As I said, not all funds are created equal, and this table, this refers to the Future Fund itself, which is worth $200 billion, and has an investment mandate to deliver a return of CPI plus an additional 4 to 5% over the long term. The equivalent equity exposure, which you can think of as a de facto measure of how much risk the fund is taking on, was 59 as at the 30th of June 2022. The smaller funds that the Future Fund Board manage, however, have investment mandates that tend to take on a lower risk profile and therefore achieve smaller returns. The Medical Research Future Fund is a prime example. Its investment mandate is to deliver a return of the RBA cash rate plus 1.5 to 2% per annum. Its equivalent equity exposure as at the 30th of June 2022 was 30, so about half that of the main Future Fund. Now that might all sound boring, context often is, but we should all be clear now that not all of these funds are created equally. We can accept that, right? I've done this before, but let's compare the proposed HAFF with the Medical Research Future Fund. The MRFF is far closer in scale to the HAFF and nowhere near the scale of the Big Puppy Future Fund. The MRFF also shares an investment mandate that's in the ballpark of the other similar and smaller sized funds managed by the Future Fund Board. The MRFF is worth a little over $20 billion. Since its inception in 2015, it's averaged a return of 4.1% per year. Like any fund relying on the stock market, it's had its ups and downs, ranging from a high of 10.9% to a low of 0.1%. So let's apply the Medical Research Future Fund's average return of 4.1% per year in the context of the HAFF.
Stay for this should be fun.
Firstly, the government borrows $10 billion. That's the $10 billion the HAFF will start with. After its first 12 months, it makes a 4.1% return. So now we have a fund worth $10.41 billion. At this stage, the HAFF can make its first disbursement because, as the Housing Minister says,
we anticipate probably in the first 12 months we'd get a return, guaranteeing a $500 million disbursement from 2024 to 25 each and every year.
So $500 million is dispersed from the fund, which is 5% of the initial investment. The fund now has $9.91 billion left. But wait, there's more. The $10 billion we started with, remember, that's borrowed money. It's a more boring context, but it is important to note that there have actually been times where the government's been able to borrow at a ridiculously low interest rate, such as March 2020, for example, where the government borrowed $1.2 billion on a 12-year loan, paying a 0.8% interest rate. But it's not 2020 anymore. Today we'd be looking at around 4% on the interest rate repayments. So let's imagine for a second that by the time the government borrow the $10 billion for the HAFF, things have miraculously turned around and they can somehow borrow at a 2% interest rate. Yes, I know I'm being overly generous, but I don't want to be accused of picking a high point. So having to pay 2% on that initial $10 billion principal, that's $200 million. And yet the bill is written so that all costs associated with the fund are to be paid by the fund. So now we have $9.71 billion. Funds aren't managed for free either. There are usually two cost components. There's the direct costs, which represent approximately 0.2% of the future fund using a 3-year average. And then there's the look-through costs, which is another 1.4%. So when you combine those fees, there's another $160 million coming out of the pot. So now the fund is worth $9.55 billion. So at the start of year 2, we have $9.55 billion. There's the 4.1% return, taking us back up to $9.95 billion. Fantastic. Then out comes the fund management fees and the interest payment on the loan, and we're back down to $9.58 billion. I mean, that's not bad. I mean, we're still a tiny little bit ahead of where we started year 2. What's that? Ah, damn it. Now we actually have to disperse the $500 million we promised to dish out each year. You remember the whole reason we started the fund in the first place? So now we're left with just over $9 billion. So in 2 years, the HAFF is down by around $1 billion, having dispersed $1 billion and paid around $300 million in fees and costs to do so, with interest on the principal then added on top of that. Now I'm assuming that the government is going to have to pay back the loan at some point, on top of the interest that's paid on the principal. When and how that happens, we don't know at this stage, but given this whole thing is supposed to be off budget, we can probably assume the intention is to pay the loan via the return, right? I mean, the bill indicates costs associated with the fund are covered by the fund itself, so it's probably yes. And someone is going to want their $10 billion back, right? I don't know where to start with that one. There's not a lot of transparency or information I could find around how this loan repayment thing's going to function. Regardless, I think you can work out for yourself why Labor tried to slip this bill through with a $500 million disbursement cap with no minimum spend. If the HAFF's investment mandate is the same or similar to the smaller scale funds, then based on their average returns, the HAFF will go backwards each year and we'll be spending hundreds of millions of dollars for the privilege. You can see why the funding model underpinning the HAFF has been questioned by economists such as Professor John Quiggin from the University of Queensland. He argues that relying on stock market returns to fund social housing is fundamentally flawed, as the case for public spending on social housing is strongest, both in terms of need and availability of resources, when the economy and the share market are doing badly. He also suggests that the housing fund is quite simply a poor substitute for direct public expenditure. I mean, he's not alone there. The Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute found that the direct investment pathway is the most cost-effective when tackling the social housing problem.
What peak body in this country hasn't come out to say, what the fuck are you doing? This housing bill that the Greens just shot down isn't just good, it's vital.
Well, there's a bit to unpack there. To be fair, you'll probably find that most peak bodies, particularly those that rely on government funding, publicly support the HAFF, but just how good and vital they view the HAFF is probably best summed up by the submissions from the peak bodies during the bill's consultation phase. The Community Housing Industry Association highlighted that the legislation as drafted provided insufficient assurances that the HAFF will deliver on its objectives. Furthermore, the HAFF at its current real value will, in all probability, exhaust its potential to fund social and affordable housing beyond the current objectives. And we've got RMIT's Centre for Urban Research saying that the commitment to build 20,000 units of social housing plus 10,000 units of affordable housing in the first 5 years of the fund is grossly insufficient, and further that attempting to address this scale of housing insecurity off budget is unrealistic and does not signal a serious government commitment to housing equality. We've got the Property Council of Australia encouraging the government to increase the ambition and scope of its investment. Similar sentiments were echoed by the Master Builders Association. The Urban Development Institute of Australia highlighted that the HAFF had potential, but that it would not deliver on that potential if the HAFF was passed without some significant amendments. They also questioned the government's ability to follow through on the promise of delivering 30,000 homes within 5 years. Industry Super Australia flagged that the level of investment income may be insufficient, while also flagging that, based on the Queensland experience, the HAFF would fall short of delivering 30,000 homes within 5 years. The University of Sydney, via the Henry Halloran Trust, made their thoughts on the HAFF fairly clear when they described the HAFF as a bad policy, while pointing out a super fun fact that is that the percentage return on the typical Australian home has exceeded the percentage return on the Future Fund since its inception in 2006. Their submission also picks up on a theme noted by others, and one of the more problematic aspects of the HAFF. The HAFF bill appears to contain little direction on how grants from the HAFF are to be spent. Homelessness Australia highlighted that the HAFF was only a fraction of what was required, and like a number of other submissions, they recommended changes to the bill to limit the discretion the Housing Minister had in allocating funding. This is going to come up again later. Another common theme across a large number of the submissions was the criticism that the bill does not define social or affordable housing. The Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute highlighted the potential impact that may have on future reporting as well. The fact these definitions weren't included in future amendments post-consultation phase would suggest it's a deliberate omission. For what purpose? My guess is it helps shift the goalposts around when it comes to reporting the success of the program in the future. So the HAFF is good and more than that vital? I think that's laying it on a little too thick. It's probably a more measured assessment to say that the concept has broad support, although there is almost, outside of the Labor Party at least, a universal view that it's just not good enough and there's room for significant improvements. Actually, that's not entirely true. There would appear to be a few in the Labor Party starting to acknowledge the same. The ACT Labor branch, for example. One organisation you won't hear a single mention of in the 65 minutes was the CFMEU, or their National Press Club address. You can watch the full address for yourself, I'll put the link in the description, and if you do, you'll probably understand why.
As we sit here today, we are about 750,000 social and affordable dwellings short of where we need to be. It is a gap that's been widening rapidly. In fact, it's 18% wider than it was a decade ago. And even with all that's been promised by governments lately, with all of those initiatives, it will still grow by another 26% by 2041. Given the importance of this problem, we are being way too timid. And I think all of us here know that.
And not to nitpick either, but the Greens didn't really shoot down the bill, they've just challenged the government to do better. It'll be voted on again in October.
The true genius of this legislation that's clearly lost on the Greens is that the HAFF acts as a rock, a pool of continual government-backed funding that keeps increasing for the rest of eternity.
Well, based on what we've seen earlier, I don't know whether or not we can actually guarantee that it's going to increase for the rest of eternity, but besides that point, apparently the true genius of this bill is that it acts like a rock, a pool of continual funding. Okay, sure. If the bill is ultimately passed with the amendments that the government were pushed to make first time around, then it will provide $500 million per year. No one is arguing about that. It's the size of the HAFF in comparison to the scale of the problem that is the issue. In that sense, the rock analogy is a good one. The HAFF is a rock. $500 million is the equivalent of dishing out one rock per year when we actually need thousands of bricks.
What the HAFF is an insurance policy for when Labor isn't in power.
You having a laugh?
The idea that the HAFF is somehow politically insulated is a bit of a laugh, really. I mean, the reality is it's not, and it's written into the bill. Any disbursement of the fund requires the approval of the government of the day. Disbursement of the fund is as open to political interference as the disbursement of any funding, and there's the potential for the same sort of interference that we've seen with the Medical Research Future Fund. If in the future we find ourselves with a government prone to a bit of old colour-coded spreadsheet pork barrelling, then that government's going to have a nice little off-budget slush fund to play around with, aren't they? Submissions during the bill's consultation phase acknowledged this, questioning the amount of discretion the Housing Minister of the day would have over the allocation of funds. If this is supposed to be an insurance policy,
It's a bad one.
Well, according to an expert the Greens are deliberately ignoring because it doesn't suit their argument, the fund has the potential to unlock within the first 2 years of its passing $9 billion of private investment.
Exactly where this $9 billion figure comes from, I'm not sure. I've had a good scratch around and I can't find any reference to it outside this particular article. I guess the word could in there is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. How $500 million from the HAFF will unlock $9 billion, I'm really not so sure. And why is $9 billion in private investment contingent on the government anyway? Needless to say, the article's light on details. Makes for a nice headline to point to though. It's worth mentioning here that the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation is a Commonwealth entity set up by the government and is part of the Treasury portfolio of agencies. The responsible minister is the Minister for Housing, Julie Collins. That's an important bit of context really. It's not often you'll see a government body reliant on government funding and reporting to a government minister openly criticising the government's policy. The other thing to call out is the fate of the NHFIC and the HAFF are intertwined to a degree. If the HAFF is passed, the CEO of the NHFIC will see the organisation he leads get a facelift and play a larger role in things.
I wonder why they're cool with, by their own admission, a neoliberal model when it satisfies even their most trivial of their whims, but they're not when it's about building basic necessities that don't affect them at all.
You having a laugh? Is he having a laugh?
So to get this straight, he's asking why someone would be cool with using a neoliberal investment and return-based funding model to fund, as he would put it, trivial things, yet they'd not be cool about using that same funding model to fund basic necessities. Does this really need an explanation?
Oh God, here we go.
Okay, here we go. So trivial is something of little value or importance. People generally don't end up homeless or worse because something deemed trivial wasn't provided enough funding. However, if you fail to provide adequate funding for basic necessities, well, I think you can see where that's going. Can you then understand why someone might be cool funding trivial stuff, using the returns on stock market investments as a funding source, yet not be all that cool about relying on the stock market to fund something required for basic human survival? Investment funds have their purpose. It's just their purpose is not to provide funding for an immediate basic human need.
The fact he's even whining about commencement date, incorrectly mind you, he repeatedly says it's 2025 over and over again.
Let's be honest, I'm not sure how 2025 is incorrect. The Housing Minister won't actually commit to a date, but when she's pressed on when the HAFF will actually deliver its first home, well 2025 sounds like the most likely outcome.
When will the first home be built?
Well, that will depend on how fast we get the fund through the Parliament. We of course already have homes on the ground, going on the ground today from the $575 million that we unlocked last year out of the Jobs and Skills Summit. And of course we've got our National Housing Accord, which starts on 1 July 2024.
I beg your pardon, in relation to this particular fund, assuming that you do get it through, when would the first home be built?
Well, it'll take a little while for those returns to come through, so the sooner we can get the fund through, the sooner we can get homes on the ground. These types of plans and projects take quite a while to get off the ground, so as soon as the bill is passed, we need Housing Australia to be going out there, working with all of the providers, working with the sector, so that we have concrete plans, so as soon as the money's able to flow, we have houses going under construction straight away.
And just briefly, how long do you think that will take?
Well, it will take a few months to get the returns from the fund. We anticipate probably in the first 12 months we'd get a return. We have agreed that $500 million will come out from 2024, guaranteed disbursement, guaranteeing a $500 million disbursement from 2024 to 25 each and every year.
I mean, the truth is the government's not going to commit to a date. Even if they did, given the ambiguity they've built into the bill by refusing to define social or affordable housing, they're giving themselves a hell of a lot of wriggle room. So on what basis is 2025 incorrect?
A lot of these houses were actually supposed to commence construction next year.
Okay, so what's being highlighted here is the National Housing Accord, which was announced in 2022. It's not the HAFF. Money for the National Housing Accord was allocated in the budget. The HAFF is off budget. Putting aside that minor issue, if a majority of the homes to be built under the National Housing Accord weren't starting construction until 2024, then yeah, 2025 seems like a reasonable time frame for the first home to be delivered. I mean, the average person knows that when you build a house, even when you don't have public money involved, it takes what, a year of paperwork minimum before you can even think about picking up a shovel? Focusing back on the HAFF though, We already know when that will start because the housing minister's told us.
And in relation to this particular fund, assuming that you do get it through, when would the first home be built?
As soon as the money's able to flow.
How long do you think that will take?
We anticipate probably in the first 12 months we'd get a return.
Granted, she wasn't going to commit to an exact date, but yeah, 2025 sounds like it's in the ballpark. Building a house in Australia doesn't just happen overnight, I mean to say.
The average person knows that when you build a house, even when you don't have public money involved, it takes what, like a year of paperwork minimum before you can even think of picking up a shovel?
So yeah, if construction wasn't going to start until 2024 anyway, and remember those are actually National Housing Accord homes he's talking about, then yeah, I'm pretty comfortable with 2025 as the earliest a HAFF home will be delivered.
For the Greens to pretend all Labor is doing is the housing fund, the Greens need to deliberately leave out that the Albanese government invested almost the equivalent of the HAFF, $9.5 billion, on housing in a single year.
Well, it's a wee bit of a straw man for starters, but let's put that to one side. The $9.5 billion sounds impressive in a press release until you realise that it's a whole bunch of stuff that have been cobbled together under the housing tag to arrive at that figure. It's a whole bunch of commitments that would have either continued regardless or have been made, whether or not the HAFF gets over the line. You'll see this shifting of the goalposts a fair bit, people rolling together a bunch of initiatives and commitments that can fall under the housing banner as if they are in any way relevant to the specific debate around the HAFF bill. The HAFF bill,
The centrepiece.
the government's housing policy, remember, is all about setting up an investment fund that will disperse $500 million per year. That's the bill in a nutshell. Whack whatever numbers you like on a whiteboard, this is the number in the bill, and the bill is what's being debated. Not what may or may not have been committed to in previous budgets, or whatever the government may decide they'll do in the future.
The Greens, with their genius negotiation skills of lying about them negotiating in the first place, got the fund to pay out a minimum of $500 million a year. And by them I mean Labor did it for them and said, look, we've included your favourite word, are you happy?
Look, I don't know who's been lying about negotiation, I'm just a guy on the internet. What I do know is that the genius policy Labor put forward initially capped the annual disbursement from the HAFF at a maximum of $500 million a year.
That's genius! Pure genius!
After amendments put forward by the Greens and the crossbench, the ceiling was removed and $500 million was introduced as the minimum. If Labor had their way, the bill would have been passed in its initial form. To be clear, Labor's genius plan was to pass a bill that literally had the potential to provide no funding at all, depending on the returns of the stock market. At best, Labor's genius plan would provide for fluctuating levels of funding each year, which doesn't provide anyone with much certainty. And after all,
You need that level of certainty if you're investing in decisions that are as long-term as building and renting out houses.
now that Labor have reintroduced the bill, they've done so without including the amendments from their first attempt at ramming the bill through. Sure, the amendments will likely get picked up again when it hits the Senate, but what does that tell you? In case it's not obvious, Labor would be perfectly happy pushing the bill through in a form that could legitimately see the fund disperse anywhere between absolutely nothing and a maximum of $500 million in any given year, depending on what happens on the stock market.
Yes, it is the most genius plan ever.
If you made it this far, congratulations, I guess. If you can handle it, stick around for part 2, which looks at the second half of the Jordies video. The second half is less focused on the HAFF and more focused on dunking on the Greens, rent control, basically anything to distract you from just how bad the HAFF is as a
Centerpiece.
policy, really.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.